Hi, everybody. Today I want to talk about someone in my life I've mentioned only briefly in other episodes, and that is my dad. My dad was definitely not a narcissist. He was what we would call an enabler of the narcissist. Now, you know how your mother is if you're on this channel. My mom is a covert narcissist, and she was abusive to me and terrible to me throughout my childhood. And so when I began to see what was wrong with my mom and just really reflected on the events that had happened in our family, a question I had was, why didn't my dad stand up for me? Why didn't he stop it? He just more or less went along. Today's episode is leaping off the last episode, where I talk about what's probably the reason that my mother is a narcissist. And just like last week, none of what I'm about to say is to excuse her behavior or my dad's. It was wrong. It was totally wrong. But it does provide an explanation that helps me. I've come to see in the last couple years that my grandma on my dad's side, she was a little on the narcissist side. My dad's dad was not present in his life. I don't know what the whole story is, but they broke up either while my grandma was pregnant with my dad or when he was a baby, but too young for him to remember his dad. And my grandma would not let him see his dad. The story is he did try to reach out and have a relationship with my dad, and my grandma wouldn't allow it. We always wondered why that was. But later, when my dad was much older in life, quite elderly, we actually connected to his half-siblings. His biological dad had remarried. He lived out in California, and he had multiple children. And just by a coincidence of things that came together, we found them. And my mom and dad flew out there to meet them. At one point, my brother went. I never really had the opportunity to go, and I guess I didn't feel the need. I'd always kind of wondered who my biological grandfather was, but once I had my questions answered, that was really enough for me. But what I was told through my brother was that my biological grandfather was a terrible, abusive man. There's a story of him being in the hospital when he was getting older, and he had pushed the nurse's button because he needed something. He wasn't having a medical emergency. He just needed the nurse for something. And if you've ever been in the hospital, you know you push that button, people aren't going to come right away. Nurses are busy, they have things to do, and they come when they can. Well, he didn't want to wait. And so when he pushed that button and someone didn't come right in the door, he picked up the phone and he called 911 to complain that the nurse was not coming in the amount of time that was acceptable to him. And they said, this is really just an example of how he was. He was very impatient. He had no tolerance for anything not going his way. And they all said, hearing about my dad's life with his dad who adopted him, as my grandma later remarried, was that my dad was very lucky that he was not raised by this man. Well, as I said, my grandmother did remarry. My dad was 9 years old at the time that they got married. And then my grandmother and my grandfather had 3 children together, in addition to my dad. I don't know very much about my grandpa. He died when I was a child. I know he was good at building things. He built their house, literally, that they lived in and raised their children in. And there's just lots of little things around that my grandpa built. Like, there's this 3-dimensional puzzle that he made. There's this rocking chair that my grandfather built for my dad. So my dad used it, and then the other 3 children used it, and we ended up with it in our house when we were growing up. And we used that chair all the time. Climbing on it, rocking on it pretty hard, tipping it backwards, and it is still so solid of a chair. My son then had it for quite a while, and it's still going strong. What little memories I do have of my grandfather being around is that he was calm and mild-mannered, he seemed. That's just from some really brief, vague memories I have, but as far as I know, that's the kind of man he was, and unfortunately, I don't really know much else about him. My grandmother died only a handful of years ago, so she had a very long life. She lived into her 90s, and I had lots of experiences with her. When I was in my early 20s, I went no contact with my mother for a little while. I did not even know the term no contact. I'm not even sure if that was a term at the time for situations like these. I didn't realize that I truly had the option to cut my mother out of my life permanently. I thought only really terrible people did that, so I just had to have her in my life. But she had said some things that were really upsetting to me, and I was really exhausted with her treatment of me, and I stopped talking to her for a few months. I wasn't sure what to do or how to cope with what was happening with my mom, and so I called one of my aunts, one of my dad's sister, and we got together and talked. Of course, neither of us knew about narcissism or covert narcissism. We were just going off the information that we had at the time, which was not very much. So she did her best to try and talk me through that and help me know how to push forward in this relationship with my mom. And the way she was able to do that was to talk about her mother, my grandmother. And I was really surprised by what she said, because my grandmother had not been that way toward me as her grandchild at all, or any of her grandchildren. My grandmother was not a very good mother. She was not involved in her children's lives. She never went to their activities or sports games or things like that. She did not support them in their pursuits. Her life revolved around her husband's life, and that came first above everything. She was pretty emotionally neglectful of her children. She was never there for them. But then when my grandpa died, my aunt said she expected all of her children to drop everything and to be there for her to a very high degree when she'd never done the same for them. And my aunt was there for her a lot after my grandpa died. My grandma lived for 30 years after the death of my grandpa, and my aunt and uncle did quite a bit to help her out. But it sounds like that was more an act of love and forgiveness than one that was deserved or owed. I believed my aunt when she told me these things, but it was surprising to hear at the time. My grandma took us shopping a lot. We spent the night at her house a lot. She babysat us a lot. She was pretty involved in my life as I was growing up. They had a playroom at their house that was filled with so many toys, and I loved going to her house. But as I got older, I saw a side to my grandmother that I hadn't been able to before. And it really helped me better connect to what my aunt had shared with me. My dad had dementia for several years before he passed away, which of course was a terrible, painful journey for all of us. The last few years that my dad was alive, he had no idea who I was, or really who anyone was. He would have bouts of really severe anger because he was so confused. And it was pretty easy to get him riled up, and it would take a very long time to get him calmed down. So during the time that he was suffering from dementia, much of our time with him centered around just keeping him calm, keeping him from getting riled up, because it was so hard to get him calmed back down. But not my grandma. Every time she was with him, she would purposely do or say things that would get him riled up. She'd watch the explosion and the drama, and then she'd leave it for all of us to have to deal with to get him calmed down. It's hard to understand how someone can see their own child as an adult suffering in this way and just poking at it and making it worse. But she did, and she did that a lot. And as I thought about that, I realized, she would say things to me that she knew would upset me, like a racist remark. I hate racism. I'm Caucasian. I've never suffered from racism, so I don't know why it's such a sensitive topic to me, but it just is. I remember in 5th grade history class, we learned about our country's history of slavery, and I was shocked and devastated, totally devastated to learn that our country had done this terrible thing. That over the years has inspired me to learn a lot about the darker side of our nation's history It's just a topic that's been of interest to me. And when people do things that are driven by racism, or they say things that are racist, it is absolutely enraging to me. I have no tolerance for it. If I meet someone, I think we're going to become friends, and they say something like that, the relationship stops immediately. I don't want to be around people like that. And my grandma knew that. She figured that out over time. And so every once in a while, she'd just throw something like that in, just to watch my reaction. She would make political comments that she knew I didn't agree with, and not to strike up a conversation about it. She didn't want to have conversations about it. She would always say it in a way to make a jab at me, so I'd get a little upset or aggravated. She seemed to enjoy that. She enjoyed upsetting people and watching their reaction. She was incredibly vain. The most vain person I have ever known or heard of. When she was older, she shopped for a new winter coat for years, for several years, because she could never find one that met her exact specifications. She was very particular about her hair and her clothes. She had cataracts, quite bad ones, in both of her eyes, and she liked to read. And it had gotten so bad she wasn't able to read. So she had the surgery on one of her eyes. The surgery went well and smoothly, but she decided not to do the other eye because the first surgery to remove the cataract in one eye had left a small bruise under her eye. And she was so mortified by this. She wouldn't go out in public. She didn't want anybody to see this bruise on her eye. It was only about a half-inch long, just this little mark. And she chose to stay blind in her other eye rather than risk having a bruise on that side of her face for a couple of weeks. She was just incredibly vain, very easily embarrassed, very obsessed with how she looked in public and what people thought of her. I've always thought she was that way because she grew up in a time, when women did have to be kind of vain. They had to present themselves well to the world. But when I think about it, I knew plenty of other women my grandmother's age, especially when you consider that my mom had many elderly widows as friends because she liked to do these over-the-top nice things for them, so they would praise her and give her all this admiration. So I grew up around lots of elderly ladies, and many of them were a little heavily focused on their looks compared to how most of us are today. But nothing to the degree that my grandmother was. That was definitely unique to her, so it couldn't have only been a result of the culture at the time. How the world saw her was of extreme importance to her. After my dad died, I had a pretty terrible experience with her. It was after the funeral, and she rode with me in my car on the way to the cemetery for the graveside service. And of course, my dad had just died. I was totally overwhelmed with grief. I was so sad. The funeral, of course, was smooth and it went well, but it was a funeral for my dad. And I was just so overwhelmed with sadness that I was not going to see him anymore. And on the way there, she was acting like nothing bad was even happening. She was talking and having conversation like we were just having an ordinary drive on an ordinary day, like just commenting on things she saw in the houses that we passed. I don't remember exactly what she said, but it was just conversation that you would have thought we were out on our way to lunch on a perfectly normal standard day. She expressed no sadness. It was so aggravating to me. It made me feel so much more overwhelmed because I just wanted quiet. I just wanted to sit and rest in what I was feeling. And yet she was acting like none of this was even happening. And this is her son we're talking about. Her son had just died, and the emotions she was showing throughout the entire day were just not natural. So, was she a narcissist? I'm sure if you know about narcissism, these things are jumping out as big signs, but knowing my grandma as a whole, I'm not sure, but I definitely think she could have been. At the very least, in the best case scenario, she had a condition that was a slightly less severe version of narcissism. And if your mother is a narcissist, you will know quite clearly this is a very severe disorder. So being slightly less severe than that is still not great. But she may have been a narcissist. And the bottom line is, I don't think she was a very good mother to my dad. And so my dad being raised by someone who at least had some of the behaviors of a narcissist, if not being an actual narcissist, would easily explain how he ended up with my mother. I myself have been a narcissist magnet my entire life. My best friend in high school, looking back on it, I can see she was likely a narcissist. I have been in multiple relationships that I can now see were very likely narcissists. They did things to me that were terrible without any remorse at all. And you know what? I did not stand up to them. I would get upset and I would get really hurt. But as soon as they started acting better toward me, that would all just fade away. And those of us who have been raised by narcissists, we tend to do that. We're programmed to do that. We have learned to cling to the tiny slivers of positive experiences and relationships while shutting out all the bad that surrounds that sliver. Because we had to do that to survive the abuse of our mothers. If we weren't able to do that, we would have just been swallowed up into the darkness. But the problem is, while that was a survival skill in our childhood and our upbringing, it unfortunately can easily become a pattern in our relationships as adults. And because of that, we can end up with all these toxic, terrible people in our lives and not even know it. Now, I feel like I'm healed enough and understanding enough that I won't have that happen to me again. But for many, many years before I understood what was going on with my mother or what was going on with me, I had no idea that this was what was going on in my life. And I had no ability to stand up for myself. And so when I think of my dad and the upbringing he probably had with his mother, it's no wonder he ended up with my mom and that he never stood up for himself. And sadly, he never stood up for me either. My dad was not an emotionally or mentally healthy person. He had terrible, crippling levels of anxiety, probably some depression. He had multiple friends in his life when he met my mom. But in the years after they got married, he just slowly drifted away from them. Eventually, he didn't have any friends at all. He just had my mom, and he had us. My dad did not make good decisions about the relationships in his life. In fact, actually, when he met my mom, he was reeling from a breakup, from a relationship he never should have had. He was dating a married woman, and she kept saying she was going to leave her husband and be with him, and he just believed her. And it went on and on and on, and he kept waiting and getting more and more upset that she wouldn't leave her husband to be with him. And then it reached this crisis level where he was so upset that she was still with her husband and hadn't left him yet. And then she told my dad she was not ever going to leave her husband and never intended to. So he did leave the relationship at that point, and he was devastated. But the fact that he ended up in that relationship and in that situation says a lot to me about my dad. I mentioned that my dad suffered from anxiety and probably some depression as well. The anxiety was very severe to the point he would vomit a lot and get very upset about things really easily. And of course, in his day, there really wasn't effective treatments for that. I have an aunt on his side, not the aunt that I went to when I went no contact with my mom in my 20s, a different aunt. She has extremely severe depression. There have been suicide attempts and hospitalizations. And my other aunt I mentioned earlier, and an uncle I have on that side of the family, have had some battles with depression too. Not as severe, but it's definitely been an issue for them. And I'd always assumed that must be a genetic thing. Like if all of the children in that family are suffering from these issues, well, it must be genetic, right? And maybe it is. But now that I see my grandmother may have been a narcissist, so when I think about that, combined with the fact that the resources we have today weren't available back then. Like my dad and his siblings didn't have the internet to find community or to read about what was going on with their mom or to learn what to do for themselves. Back then, you really only went to therapy if there was something extremely severe that you were suffering from. And I really doubt that there was any therapist available who was trained in narcissistic parental abuse at the time. So even if my dad had gone to therapy, it's unlikely he would have found somebody that would have known how to really help him with his problems. The medications we have today to help with various mental health issues were not available back then. So yeah, maybe this is genetic, but maybe it's not something that runs in my family. Maybe they all have these problems because of the damage they endured as children from the treatment that they received in their family. So after a lifetime of being programmed in this way, he ended up with my mother. And he never stood up to her for me because he didn't even know how to stand up for his own self. Now that's not an excuse. It explains what happened. And just like I explained in my last episode about how and why my mother probably ended up with narcissistic personality disorder, that's not an excuse either. It just helps me understand. And in the same way, I look at my dad's life, and I come to the same conclusion I came to in my last video, and that was that this had nothing to do with me. These were events that took place long before I was born. So it's not my fault. And it's not your fault. If your other parent was a narcissist too, or an enabler, or maybe they just left and left you behind, that didn't happen because you didn't deserve better than that. I deserved better. You deserved better. The events that led up to these entire scenarios, they happened before we even existed. So it didn't have anything to do with you. It didn't have anything to do with me. And we can be relieved of that burden. We don't have to wonder, was I just not good enough to be defended? Was there something I was doing wrong that was keeping him from standing up for me? No. Because our parents became the way they are before we were even born. And we can find some peace in that at least, and a better understanding of ourselves. I feel I have opportunities my dad didn't get to have. I can learn about this disorder. I can see a therapist if I need to, who's trained in the type of abuse I've endured. All the help he would have had available to him were he born today. He didn't have that, but I do. When my dad died, a little over 10 years ago, I thought about my relationship with him, which had often been rocky and just difficult. There were plenty of things that used to upset me about him. But I thought about how much pain he felt every day of his life, all the way to the end. My dad was just never really happy, and I felt so sorry for him. I felt so much sympathy and pity, and I still do. You know, my dad did show me love in some ways from time to time. He had a temper, and sometimes he'd lose his cool, and he could get pretty mean sometimes. But later, he would come on his own initiative and apologize every time. Now, that doesn't make it right. But after living with my mother, who has no capacity to ever consider her behavior or acknowledge the things she's done to me, a sincere apology from my dad always meant a lot to me. And I guess that true regret he felt did show that he cared about me. And I do believe my dad did his best under his circumstances. He worked at a terrible job that he hated that made his mental health issues so much worse. But he still went to make sure the bills were paid and we had food to eat. When I was a teenager and out running with my friends, I could call him at any time unless he was at work, and he would drop everything and come pick me up, drive me to where I needed to go, or bring me home, or take me to a friend's, whatever I needed. He fell short in dozens of ways. But he did show me some love, and he did do his best. He loved me in the ways that he was able. And of course, I wish that were different. I wish he could have done better. But that's not anything that I can change. And with a mother who really never treated me with love, All I really have are these little pieces of love my dad imparted to me. And I do embrace those, especially knowing there are many others who didn't get to have even that. I mentioned my dad worked this terrible job. He worked at a factory on an assembly line. Just very boring, very tedious. My dad was actually a brilliant man, and he just needed a more challenging job than that. When my dad joined the Navy, they had them take these tests to see if they had any special skills. And he took a test about electricity. My dad had no education or training in electricity at all. And he scored the highest on that test out of 1,000 people that took it. He said, well, I didn't even know any of the answers. I just guessed. But one day I pressed him on that for more detail, and he said he just looked over the answers and picked the ones that made the most sense. My dad figured out how to get a very high score just by thinking things through on a subject he had no training in whatsoever. So he ended up having a very easy stint in the Navy. He worked on a ship just doing some basic electrical things in a tropical area. There are so many exciting things he could have done in a career. But he got out of the Navy and just walked into a factory and did that his entire life. And that says a lot about his self-esteem and about his perception of his ability to make his life better, which was basically no ability to do so at all. When my dad died, the first year and even a lot of the second year was really hard. I remember that first year I would get off of work. I had a pretty emotionally invested job. I worked at a mental health facility for children that were long-term institutionalized with severe behavior disorders and things like that. So it was a busy job that took a lot out of me. So I was always okay when I was there because I just sort of turned that off so I could focus on my job. But every night, I would clock out and go to my car, and the second I closed the door, I would just start crying. And then I'd cry off and on the whole way home. I did that every day for much of that first year. As time has passed, of course, we learn to cope with the grief and to carry it and to move on with our lives. But I do miss him. One thing my dad did do right is that he listened to me. He didn't stand up for me or help me with my problems in the way he should have, but he at least listened and showed sorrow or being upset. And that's something my mom was never able to do. And I suppose that's why that aspect of him has meant so much to me. To make a comparison, I don't miss my mother. This month marks 3 years that I've been no contact with her. And I really have no memories of, oh, when she used to do such and such, oh, I miss that. There were never moments like that with her. There's nothing to miss in my relationship with her. I did sometimes talk to my dad about how my mom was treating me. And this is how I know he was specifically an enabler. He would listen to me and let me say what I had to say. And then his reply would almost always be, well, you know how your mother is. After I learned about covert narcissism, and then I began to learn about enabler spouses, I was completely shocked to read that a very common statement that they will make is, you know how your mother is, or you know how your father is, depending on who is saying it. Like word for word what my dad used to say to me. I was reading it on a website written by a psychologist all about narcissistic parental abuse. My dad was a damaged person, and he never learned to stand up for himself, and he was never able to stand up for me. He just wasn't able to. And again, none of this is an excuse that my dad enabled her. It's just an explanation, and it's an explanation that reminds me of two things. One, as I've already mentioned, it wasn't my fault. Why didn't he stand up for me? It wasn't because I didn't deserve for him to do so. It was, like I said, he was a very damaged person. He had no ability to stand up for anyone, not even himself. And secondly, Understanding all of this challenges me to make better decisions for my own life. It inspires me to take advantage of the resources my dad didn't get to have, but I do. In all the ways my dad did not make better decisions so he could have a better life, I'm not going to make the same decisions he did. I am not going to sit down and let narcissists walk all over me. I'm going to take control of my life. I'm going to stand up for myself when people mistreat me, and I will stand up for others when people mistreat them. I'm going to stand up and advocate for my son when he needs it, which my dad was never able to do for me. I strive to be the person my dad could have been had things gone differently. So my dad's life is, to me, a really sad story filled with so much pain. But that's not how my life is going to be. So I'm focusing on what I can control. I'm changing things for myself and for my life. And I hope that perspective helps you as you resolve questions about your own past, and that it inspires you with a perspective to hold as you look toward your future. Our parents did not take control of their own lives. They succumbed to the damage and the abuse. But we don't have to do that. We can look at their lives and learn from their mistakes so that we can make our lives better toward here and move toward the futures that we want. I'll see you next week. And please remember, to all my fellow survivors, you are worthy, you are valuable, and you are beautiful, whether your mom sees that or not.